enterprise architecture at Thomson Reuters, and the topic is GDPR, quite interesting topic at least. My journalists quite keen to know what it is. So, Dr. David Parrot, please welcome.
Thank you. So my name is David Parrot. I head up enterprise architecture at Thomson Reuters Enterprise Centre in Bar in Switzerland. Just a quick check, hopefully you can all hear me at the back. I've got a microphone if you can't, but my amateur theatrics is helping with the projection here, so hopefully that should work. So Thomson Reuters, we're an $11 billion company. We specialise in information, and I joined the business almost 20 years ago, it's 20 years this year, working for Reuters. And I've always done enterprise architecture style roles. And about a year and a half ago, I was drafted in to look after the technology side of the work that we're doing to come into compliance with the European Union's General Data Protection Regulation. And so this is all about privacy. And Thomson Reuters is taking this very seriously. As an information company, we deal with information of all kinds, and being in full compliance with this kind of regulation is incredibly important to us. So let me just start by asking a question. So how many people in this room at some time or another have been completely freaked out by their iPhone or other Apple device suddenly announcing to them it's going to take you 45 minutes to get home, 20 minutes to get home, or, you know, who's had that experience, right? It's a little bit freaky, right? Now, this tends to happen to me just at the point I'm getting into my car. It buzzes and it says like 9 minutes. Now, this is, it's nothing new. It's been in the Apple devices since iOS 7. It's a special feature. It's based on something called frequent locations that get set up in your iPhone when you first set up location services. It's buried right down deep in the options. But we're probably used to the fact that the iPhone nowadays and many devices are getting smarter, right? So if you put a meeting in your diary nowadays, if you type in a location, the ID device will probably spot exactly where that is and give you a proper map reference. And it is able to look at your meeting invites and actually give you advice on how long it's going to take to get to that place. But with frequent locations, there's something a little bit more sinister going on, right? What the iDevice is doing is using GPS to track your movements, right? It knows where you are. Not only is it tracking your movements, but what it's also doing is actually, plotting them over time. And it spots that in the evening you tend to spend quite a bit of time in the same location, every day. And it calls that home, right? And it also spots that, 9 o'clock in the morning you arrive fairly consistently, Monday to Friday, in the same place. And it calls that work, right? It's analysing you, it's profiling you, it's actually working out what's going on in your life. Right? Now, this is why it gets a bit freaky, because without you telling it anything at all, it's telling you it's going to take 9 minutes to get home, and it's doing it just as you're opening your car door, right? So this is an example of where, in the modern world, our privacy is being impacted. In that case, it's actually for a very positive, well, actually you could argue it's probably useless, because if you wanted to know how long it's going to take you to get home, you'd look it up in maps anyway, right? So, but your privacy is being impacted, and in lots of different ways. And essentially, this is why we care about privacy regulation. So let me give you a second example. A couple of ski seasons ago, my wife and I had a brilliant morning of skiing, and it was coming up to lunchtime. We were getting a bit hungry, and it was a really popular ski resort, and all of the main ski racks were taken. So we happened to spot a big heap of skis all sort of stuck into the snow, and we added ours to the end of that section. We went up to lunch, had a lovely lunch. We came back, and the big pile of skis was gone, including mine. Right? So my wife's was still there, and there was one more pair of skis about a metre away. So after the initial shock had subsided, somebody stole my skis, I kind of figured, well, actually, this is quite a safe resort. It's probably incompetence rather than malice that's led to my skis disappearing. There's another pair here. Let's take a closer look. And this is what I saw. This is the photograph I took at the time. Now, what I noticed was that this pair of skis had been rented. And there was enough information on the sticker for me to track down the rental shop. So I duly went along to the rental shop, pointed out that I thought this person Colin here had accidentally taken my skis, and could we do something about this? So the rental shop then got on the telephone trying to track down Colin. They got onto his tour rep. They then concluded they couldn't find him. So they then confirmed to me, yes, Colin had rented the skis that morning with his 2 teenage daughters. They told me his nationality, and they proceeded to tell me which hotel he was staying at. On top of that, I inferred that Colin's boot size was roughly similar to mine, otherwise he'd be having a terrible time with it. Right, so now I've got quite a bit of information about Colin, and they asked me to hang around for 3 or 4 hours and wait till later, and eventually they could help me out. So I decided to do the detective bit. I got on the bus, I found Colin's hotel, which was actually quite tricky. It was in the back streets. I went to reception, there was nobody there. But what I did notice was that there were people going into the ski room. So I thought, great, there are people coming back, let's have a nose around. So I popped into the ski room, lo and behold, there were my skis. Right? So at this point, I figured, okay, shall I just take them? I was really tempted because, I quite fancied the idea of Colin coming in the following morning thinking, my skis have been stolen. Having been through the same thing myself. But no, I went back and I found somebody at that hotel, and I left a note for Colin, essentially saying, please go back to the ski shop, you'll find your skis there. That's where I left them for him. But this is a very salutary note in terms of what happens when companies are really willing to give up information about you. I had enormous amounts of information about Colin, and if I'd have been a less honest person, I could have probably actually done him some quite severe damage in one way or another. And it was just that I was just happy to get my skis back, and so it all ended reasonably well. But should that company have given me all that information? Probably not. So why do we protect privacy? I mean, nowadays there's an enormous amount going on in terms of the types of benefit that you can get from all this advanced information. I gave you the Apple iPhone example. We're all geeks, we get cool personalization, we get targeted information, smart services that really understand what we're about. And we all appreciate those kind of things when they work in our favour. But on the flip side, we've got all those other things. We've got fraud, we've got malicious profiling, you've got defamation of character, identity theft, and that's a big one. Right? Identity theft, everybody is quite familiar with just the sort of impact that can happen if somebody decides to steal your identity. Now, not that long ago, many retail bank employees used to have a lot of fun. I know this because I knew some back in the 90s who would tell me, it's great, we had a half-hour spare this afternoon. I went fishing around all the celebrity accounts. I could see where they were spending their money. And of course, banks have got wise to this, and they've tightened the rules quite significantly in the 20 years in between. But how many people in this room have received unsolicited phone calls from their bank, and the first thing they say to you is, could you give us your security information? Tell us your mother's maiden name. Now, actually, there's a really good reason why they do that, and that's because bank employees can no longer just go and access your private data. They actually need a key to get in, and the key is your security information. Now, there are several problems with what the bank is doing, right? So firstly, they actually legitimise the fact that if somebody phones you up and asks you for your security information, you should just give it to them, right? And of course, that's a ridiculous thing to do. What they should be doing is saying, please look up your customer services number, give us a call, and we'll take it from there. And the other thing, of course, is it's pseudo-security, because it rather relies on the policies within the bank that says, please don't write down and keep for your own personal use the security information that's given to you by particular individuals. And I know somebody in the US who works for Medicare, and their primary key is their social security number. And they have a similar thing in Medicare. They say do not write down anybody's social security number, because if you have that, you can actually get into the system and view all their private information. So there are certainly flaws in the way that we deal with protecting people's private data today. So along comes the GDPR, the European Union's General Data Protection Regulation. And what's changed? You know, privacy regulation has been around for a very long time. We've got a whole series of long-standing regulatory principles that are already there, embedded into European and other law. The key principles cover things like limitation of collection. Don't collect more than you actually need for your business purpose. They cover things like data quality. If you're collecting private data, make sure that it's of sufficient quality, that you're not damaging individuals by having poor quality data. They also insist that you have legitimacy of purpose. So you've got to be able to demonstrate why you're keeping that data. You can't just randomly collect huge amounts of private data for no purpose. And they also insist that you have security safeguards in place, a lot better than some of the ones I've just been talking about. And then there's the principle of openness. So if you or I as an individual feel that somebody is collecting data about us, we need to know about that. We need to be told that there's private data. We need to understand what the policies of the various organisations are that we're dealing with. But then, how many of us get presented with the 72-page privacy policy and click through without reading even the title? But then there's also the individual's right of access and challenge. So you can actually go and look up, what's there. And you can challenge the data that's recorded about you. And all of these things are incredibly long-standing principles. There's nothing new introduced by the GDPR. But some of the problems that you have are the technology is moving forward. We have things on both sides. We have big data analytics, and somebody mentioned that earlier in this room today. Companies can do more to profile you and understand you better, ostensibly in the hope that they're going to be able to provide you with a more targeted service. But there are risks associated with that. And similarly, we have, we're all familiar with the social media context where, somebody happily pops up, happy birthday Granny Smith, right? Thereby letting on their mother's maiden name, right? They then follow that with a post to say, really looking forward to my holiday, going to be in the Canaries for the next 2 weeks. There's all sorts of information that people are just putting out there, even without us as companies collecting it on their behalf. And so there's a lot more awareness of the dangers of privacy information. Now, it's worth pausing for a second and just reinforcing, what do we mean by privacy data? So often, we've referred to this as personally identifiable information, or PII, right? And many people just assume that when they hear the term PII, it's about your telephone number, your address, how can I instantly identify you as an individual? But it's actually a lot more than that. It's actually any data that can be pinned back to a living individual. Any data at all. So any of that sort of tracking information in terms of your web clicks, that's all PII. All of this stuff is under the heading. And all of those principles that I outlined, have been standing for a long time. But the big difference with GDPR is that now we have to become much more proactive, right? In the past, if you had a problem and some idiot left their briefcase on the train and it had a whole bunch of personal data in it, yes, it hit the headlines, but then the privacy regulator would get interested and they'd come and check, do you have the right security processes, and they'd give you a bit of a kick. Nowadays, with GDPR, the whole thing has been inverted. Just like Sarbanes-Oxley, you have to be able to get out there and prove to the regulator, if they just come and ask, no issues at all, they'll just come and ask, have you got all the right security processes in place? Do you understand what PII you have? Do you have all that transparency that I just talked about, and so on? And that all has to be done, proactively. So that's the compliance side. You must be able to demonstrate compliance. They've also tightened up hugely in terms of data breach notifications. So you've got to be able to satisfy a data breach, you've got to be able to report it within 72 hours. And that isn't just putting your hand up saying, I think we've lost some data. You've got to go back with a full report within 72 hours. So it's much tougher than it's ever been. And there's also a tightening of consent around individuals and data subjects in terms of the consent that you obtain from them. And then their right to erasure has been tightened up as well. So if an individual contacts you and says, you've got data about me, I want you to take it out. Now, actually, your legitimacy of purpose may well argue back and say, sorry, you don't actually, we need to keep that data, because if we don't, we can't do business with you. Now, the individual could say, fine, let's cut the relationship, in which case you still have to proceed. But the other big thing about GDPR is the 4% of global turnover fines that have been introduced, and that tends to wake senior executives up, and it certainly has in my company. You know, we started to pay quite significant attention to that. And that's a serious number, because it isn't just one piece of your business finds itself out of compliance and they look at its global revenue. They look at the global revenue for the whole company. So any diddly squat little part of your business could get you into really hot water if you have an egregious breach. So this regulation is very serious. So I mentioned legitimacy of purpose. And this is something that's kept us on our toes for quite a long time, because as we've looked across in Thomson Reuters the different systems and information stores that we have, one of the biggest questions when we run our privacy impact assessments is, why are you holding that data? Can you, if a regulator comes around and wants to audit you, can you hand on heart describe exactly the business processes that support and why you absolutely have to have that piece of data? And of course there is a complete spectrum of why privacy data is collected, right? You know, there's the benign stuff right on the far left there. I need this data because I can't send you a bill if I don't have your address, right? That's pretty obvious. Yeah. You then get into the sort of controversial part of the spectrum where it's, you know, maybe not that controversial. I'm tracking you to see if I can sell more to you. Okay? But as an individual, you might not want that. So that's where you start to get into this whole consent thing. Right? The next one down is a bit interesting. I'm trying to filter out undesirables. Now, from a business perspective, that makes an awful lot of sense. But do you have robust processes for deciding who an undesirable is? Or are you playing God and just kind of saying, well, I don't like him, he's wearing a pink shirt? Right? You know, and that's where the controversy can come into play. And then, of course, there's the whole kind of, you know, the big data analysis. If I can mine my databases of records, I can find out so much more about you. And this is where we get into potential hot water, because if you're doing something called profiling, what the Apple iPhone is doing, analysing information, it's not just collecting information, you're actually deriving new information, and that in itself, you know, can be dangerous for many, many reasons. But then, of course, as you move across the spectrum, it all starts to get rather nasty. There's some distinctly shady stuff. I've got a cartel going, and I'm secretly swapping notes so that we can price fix. Now, that's moving actually into the criminal. But then on the criminal side, you know, there's a lot of this stuff going on. It's the sale of credit card numbers and all sorts of other data. But it isn't just the obvious fraud that we're worried about. It's also identity theft, and the huge risk is that we can get into, you know, damage against the character, we can get into identity theft and so on. And all of this adds up to why we all care so much about privacy, and why so much pressure is being put on companies like Thomson Reuters to do a much better job than they ever have done in the past. And so let me just tell you a little bit about some of the things that we're doing. Well, so firstly, it's useful to know that Thomson Reuters, as an information company, actually has an enormous amount of different types of information over and above what you'd normally expect within a corporation. So, sure, we have the usual transactions about what's being bought and by whom, but essentially we're a B2B business, and we're not dealing with consumers quite so much, but we still have personal data in the sales transactions and so on. And then, of course, we have HR data. We have data about our employees, so as every other company does, and we care about managing that. But then we also run software as a service. So we have data belonging to our customers, right, and in our data centers. And many of our customers are people like lawyers and financial advisors. So they have clients, and the data they're putting into our systems are things like the tax returns of their clients or the financial investment strategies of their clients. And all of this information is incredibly sensitive. Now, interestingly, none of that actually sits on the European Union's list of special categories of data. The EU pulls out some really, really sensitive stuff, which tends to be things like political beliefs, trade union membership, sexual orientation, those kind of things. And it doesn't mention things like geopolitical data, but it does care if you're profiling. But we certainly have enormous amounts of what we think of as quite sensitive data, because if you know how, what an investment strategy of a company or an individual is, you can actually act against them quite badly. We also have products that make it into the headlines of the newspapers because we provide services for know your supplier, know your customer type services. And that can be incredibly sensitive information about the history of individuals, and certainly does have things like criminal records data in it and so on and so forth. So, we have a lot of data that falls really into the line of sight of the privacy regulator. And then on top of that, where we have our legal information business, we have extensive records going back over decades of the outcomes of legal cases. And, including cases that were, where people have been acquitted. But we've got records of accusations made against individuals and so on. So there's an enormous amount of data, as you can see, that goes well beyond that standard set of data that companies have for managing their business. And so, in response to this, we've been running a relatively high-profile program that we've called Privacy Matters. And we have hired Deloitte to come and help us out, because it's not the sort of program you can, and we tried this by the way, it's not the sort of program you can run with 2 men and a dog very easily, because it actually is quite impactful across the organisation. So some of the sorts of things that we've had to do to get ready for GDPR are, firstly, build a database of what PII we have. Because when we took a look, virtually nobody knew. There were hundreds of products out there, lots of different ways in which data was being managed and dealt with. We absolutely had no clue when we first started off this whole exercise exactly where it was. So we could certainly track it down, but it was going to be a very long-winded exercise. And so now we've fixed that. We have a much better database that will take us instantly to any PII that we have around the organisation. Then the second thing that we had to do was to look right across our product and technology estate to identify where we felt that there were any high-risk areas that were dealing with PII. And there were numerous problems that we identified. So one was, did we have compliance with our own security policies? We've got very strong security approach to security within Thomson Reuters, but did we have known compliance issues with our own policy? And so if we did, wherever we found those went right to the top of the list of things that needed to be fixed. And we're actually running quite a big program in terms of remediating any of these kind of issues. The other thing we found was that we had, I can't remember exactly how many now, but a high number of hundreds of different privacy statements across our various products and technologies. And there was no consistency, and it's really hard to manage this stuff if everybody's making up their own privacy statement all over the place. So we've had to instigate a single, shared, standard privacy statement for Thomson Reuters. And of course, that requires every online product and deployed product and so on to be able to go back and link back to that in the right way. And it's more than that, you actually have to bring it to the attention of your customers. So you've got to add pop-ups into your product and be able to check when that pop-up has been seen, because you don't want to keep irritating the customer, throwing it back up and so on. So there's quite a lot to do around that space. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the other big area was around legitimacy of purpose, and this links to data retention policies as well. So, am I storing and collecting too much? If I'm not, if it's okay, I've got the right business purpose for it, am I actually getting rid of it when I don't need it any longer? Because a big risk is when privacy data just sloshes around in your systems forever. You've stopped doing business with a customer, but you've still got their privacy data in your systems. And so, we then reviewed literally right across the board every application we had did we have a means for deleting out-of-date data? And surprise, surprise, virtually no application in Thomson Reuters had a means for deleting out-of-date data. So another thing went onto the remediation list. And so those have been really the key areas, I think, for us. But the other big part, that was in terms of remediating the technology. The other big part is, do we have all the right contracts in place with our customers and suppliers? So as we're handing off to suppliers, whether it's supplying us with cloud services or database services, or if they're doing sort of HR processing, are those suppliers themselves in compliance? Can we trust them? Do we have the right back-to-back agreement so that when the regulator comes to inspect us, we can actually provide the right documentation to say that we believe our suppliers are in compliance also. And similarly with our customers, so we had to renew contracts right across the board in terms of the contracts that we have in place with our customers, because they're looking for the same assurances from us, but we're also trying to limit the liability. And so there's a big activity for the lawyers there to go and refresh all of those contracts. And then the other big piece that I think is really interesting is introducing privacy by design. Because one of the biggest things over the last 18 months for us has been, privacy wasn't built in to the architecture of our systems to begin with, and the architecture of our business processes to begin with. And just like everybody's familiar nowadays with building financial controls in so that we can satisfy Sarbanes-Oxley, we have to get ourselves to the same place from a privacy perspective, because believe me, it costs a lot more to remediate this stuff than it does to build it in to begin with. And so we're actually running a very big awareness program. We've identified people across the organisation that need to be trained. We've identified best practices. And this, I can promise you, is not about putting a piece of privacy technology into your estate and getting everybody to use it. There's no such thing. It's really all about how we do business, how we think, how we design our processes and systems. And so that's been a huge program that's been running for well over a year now, and it's actually been done in collaboration between enterprise architecture, information security, and the lawyers in our privacy office. And it had to be a kind of three-way conversation. Any one of those groups are not going to achieve it by themselves. So, now, GDPR comes into compliance in May 25th, 2018. This is a date that's etched on my brain. The regulators are going to be looking for serious application of solutions to bring you into compliance. I mean, nobody is going to be 100% in compliance, but the regulators will be going after big names. They'll be wanting to make a point. Otherwise they wouldn't have put in quite so much effort to revamp, what was already quite an established set of principles and so on. So it's a date to take very, very seriously. And we've now got to the position in Thomson Reuters where we have committed roadmaps and so on for all outstanding compliance issues. So we're looking to be ready in May 2018. But if you've not started, I would certainly urge you to take a very, very serious look. So I'm going to stop there and open the floor for questions.
Quick question. This is going back. In Europe, they've got the telephone data protection and stuff. How does this affect that? Because I did some designs with them, and I just wondered how that.
Yeah, so it's so I'm not a lawyer, by the way.
No.
I'm an architect, right?
Yeah.
But I think one of the interesting aspects of all of this is how different regulation plays against each other, and sometimes regulation can actually be can pull in opposite directions, right? So every piece of regulation stands by itself, and you have to be in compliance, right? And you have to look at all these pieces of regulation in the whole. And so in my business, the original Reuters part of the business was very focused on financial services, for example. And there's plenty of regulation in the financial space that tells us that we need to keep very detailed records, for example, over financial transactions that are undertaken. So foreign exchange, whatever. We run, within Thomson Reuters, effectively exchanges, like foreign exchange and so on. And so we actually have some regulation that is telling us to crank up the amount of personal data that we collect, whilst other regulations are telling us to limit the amount of personal data that we collect. And there are different rules over how long you should be keeping this stuff. One is giving you a minimum, one is telling you you've got to minimise it. right? So you have to take all of these pieces of regulation together and then figure out, and it's not easy because they're in conflict quite often, right? You have to figure out what a regulator is likely, or how a regulator is likely to respond, right? Now, no regulator is going to come along and slap you for, one regulation because you're trying to be in compliance with another. But you have to have thought it through properly, I think. So I'm giving you a little bit of a roundabout answer, but there is no simple answer. You have to look at these things, in the whole. Yeah.
Have you attempted to quantify the cost of breaching compliance?
Yep.
And have you gone beyond that to look at benefits of the opportunities,
yes,
or things you do better because of? Have you attempted to quantify that?
Yes, so yes to all of those questions. So the cost of compliance, in fact, it's interesting because it depends which industry you're in. I was speaking to somebody who was in the insurance industry, and they were telling me that their insurance firm had put aside $100 million to come into GDPR compliance, right? Because they're dealing with an enormous number of individuals as well as companies and so on, and their budget was huge. But absolutely, these are not small numbers, right? So we've had to think very carefully about how much it's costing us, and there's a lot of hidden costs. You can run a program that has a cost of its own, but will typically generate a whole bunch of remediation activity that your business units have to pick up. And so we're in the process of bringing all those numbers together to understand the full impact. It's really important. And then in terms of the benefits, let's face it, a lot of our executives initially said, well, hang on a second, if we use this to be a differentiator for us, that's actually quite tough because everybody's in the same boat, right? So, these are table stakes in the main. In many industries, you're not going to be allowed to play. Nobody's going to want to do business with you if you don't come into compliance. So we stop looking for huge benefits, differentiators, and so on relatively early. But we're certainly looking at where we can tighten things up. Just getting much better information security compliance and being able to score well in terms of the benefits of strong information security compliance is one area, for example, where we've actually seen true benefit, having kicked lots of people for constantly putting things on risk registers and never actually getting around to result. I think strengthening things like that is where I think we're seeing benefit.
So if you want to believe some of the articles we're reading, many companies won't breach GDPR compliance on time by next year.
Yeah.
What's your advice in terms of where the priorities should be amongst so many things you need to do to reach that compliance?
Well, I think the approach that everybody has to take, certainly we have, and I'm sure many others are, you have to take a risk-based approach, right? That's something we've said loud and clear right from the beginning. We are, it's absolutely impossible for a company to fix every single possible issue, in such a short time. It will bankrupt the company. So what you have to look at is, where is the risk of greatest exposure? Where is the risk of the likelihood of issues occurring? But then not ignore everything else, because that in itself would take you out of compliance. You've got to have a program for how you're going to deal with that stuff over a long period of time. And I think that the regulator is going to be looking for very serious approaches for addressing compliance issues, right? But if you haven't ticked every single box, but you have a plan for how you're going to, I think you're likely to be in a better position. So take a risk-based approach, figure out what your capacity is and what you can actually achieve, and consult with legal teams. We've consulted with external counsel who've helped us come to resolution on that and so on. But yeah, it's not simple. But it's unlikely that everybody's going to be 100% compliant. Main issue. Come out of time. Thank you very much.